Hi, and welcome to another episode of Reinventing Your Home. My name is Ross, and in this week's video we're making this big L-shaped desk that is going in a rather small office. So join me in the next 20 minutes to see how we did that. Like most cabinetry projects, we start by cutting some plywood. What we're doing here is we're cutting the pieces to size for our main carcass. The material that we use here is maple plywood, which is one of my favorites. And once we have all of the pieces cut up to size, we can go ahead and put our pocket holes. Those are intended to hold our face frame. None of them would be seen because all of them would be covered by our side panels, but this is something that you will see later in the video. As you can see, all of our pocket holes have to face forward because once again this is where our face frame is going to be. And then once all of that is done, we can go ahead and assemble the unit. We're using the simple method of pinning it with a nail gun and then screwing it together. And then after that we can attach the legs, as you can see here, and then after that we can put the top of the cabinet. Now I'm using the biscuit jointer here. Not really necessary to use that tool, but at the time of filming I had just bought it because it was on sale, and I was just eager to try and use it on a project. Not really necessary. You can well do that without a biscuit jointer. However, as I said that to you, I've just bought it and I thought, well, I'm just gonna try and use it on something because I was curious. It did a fantastic job, by the way, but again, one of the things that it's not absolutely necessary, could have been done without. But you can see it quite easy here to slide the biscuits. It kind of sits in place, and then after that I can just pin and screw it, but I could have well done that without the need of putting biscuits. Once that was done, it was time to put the back. As you can see here, a couple of my corners weren't aligning properly. So I spend a little bit of time with the number 4 smoothing plane just to make sure that it's all flush, so once we put the back on we won't end up with any gaps once it's screwed and nailed in place. The process I use to attach my back is I would pin it in place with nails on one side, I would go over with screws the same side, then I would flip the whole unit around, I would tap it side to side until it's square, because I've made sure that my back is perfectly square. With these cabinets, once you assemble them without the back, they're very rarely they are square. So use the back to make sure that it's all pulled back in square. And then after that, it's just a case of finishing the rest of the sides, pinning and screwing in place. I'm using a 16 gauge nail gun with 45mm nails, so I could finish it just with that. However, I like to put a couple of screws just for a good measure. And then after that, what I want to do here is I want to go over with a sander, sand all of my external edges. None of those are going to be seen. However, the reason I like to do that is because plywood is notorious for giving you splinters, so when I'll be lifting it, which I will do that a few times, I always get splinters in my hand, so I quite like to sand those edges and get rid of the splinters. That's the reason. And then the front, I would just make sure that it's nice and flush for the frame, and then we can start making said frame. So what we do here is we've got a plain old round timber. We're just cutting the pieces for the frame to size on the mitre saw. Drill our pocket holes, which we'd use to assemble the frame. And when it comes to face frames, this is by far the easiest method of assembling it, because all of those pocket holes would be butting against the cupboard, so none of those would be seen. It's just a great way of very efficiently built a face frame. And then the next thing I would do is I would put it on the clamps. You see, one of the problems you can get with pocket holes is that when you're driving your screws in, it kind of has a tendency of pushing your pieces away from each other, and that means that you could end up with a little gap in the joint. So one way to overcome this is to put it on the clamps. So once you put it on the clamps, put some pressure on it, pieces have nowhere to go, so you can drive your screws and you can get a perfect joint, as you can see me doing here. However, I do understand that's not always an option. Sometimes you're building larger face frames that require longer clamps, and I've run into that problem many times before where I didn't have the clamps. In that case, you'd have to be more creative and figure out a way to do it. However, in this instance, the frame happened to be small enough and I had clamps that were perfect size. So as you can see, I've had it clamped in and I can safely drive all of my screws and get it done. Now that it's off the clamps, you can get it out straight away. And then it's just a case of doing a few finishing touches. So what we do here is we're going over with the sander inside and out, making sure everything's nice and flush. We don't have a lot to sand, but it's just a nice touch if you go over it. Then after that, I would go with a router, create a chamfer. This is going to meet our side panel, but you will see that in a minute. Doing some priming. I like to paint this frame before I install it because we're keeping the natural wood, the look of the plywood inside the cabinet. And then that's pretty much done on the cabinet, so we go ahead and start making the drawers. So this is a very simple construction here. We're using the same plywood for the drawers. So we cut some strips on the table saw, and then we have to create the groove for the bottom of the drawer. We do that with a little 1/4 inch router, after which all of our strips are done, and then we can cut them to size. Now, for once in my life, I had actually created a cutting list, and as you can see, I'm going through it right now. So that's pretty simple. We're just going cutting all the pieces in preparation for making the drawer boxes. One thing you have to be very careful here is you've got to make sure that all of those pieces are square. So on the beginning of the strip, I would check if the piece is square. If not, I would trim slightly so I can have a square reference point and then cut the rest of them like that. Then after that is a case of drilling all the pocket holes, which took a while. So I want to switch to a time lapse in a minute because there was a lot of pocket holes to drill. I did not enjoy that. But at some point, whenever I can afford it, I'll probably get myself one of those big fancy pocket hole machines, so I don't have to drill it with my jig forever. As you can see here, there were all of those pieces to do. So that was the most boring part of creating the drawers, just drilling all the pocket holes. Once we had all the pocket holes drilled, it was a time to start assembling the drawer boxes. As you can see here, I'm using exactly the same method as I did when assembling the face frame. I would put the drawer box in the clamp. That way I can drive all of my screws without worrying that it's going to push the pieces apart. And we do that several times. After that, we can attach the face frame. We do that for a reason. So because of the type of drawer runners that we were using, I wanted to put the frame in order to get the offset for the drawer faces. So all of the drawer faces have to be flush with the frame. Hence, we need to make sure that the drawer runners are at the appropriate offset from the face frame. As you can see, the frame has been painted for reasons that I explained earlier, and you can kind of see that the inside of the cabinet has been finished with some varnish as well. We have the difference of the paint and the natural color inside, so that's why it's easier to paint it before you install it. You can cut in with a brush, but it's easier done that way. These, by the way, are the side panels that I was mentioning. As you can see here, they cover the pocket holes that hold the face frame perfectly. We fixed them from the inside with screws. You can see here me doing that. None of those screws are going to be seen. That's where the drawers are, and once you have the drawers extended, you cannot see the screws, so we're fixing them from the inside. And then after that is a case of installing the drawer runners. So these are not my favorite drawer runners, and that's not to say that they're bad, but I don't like them very much because with them you have to be very, very precise in terms of making your drawer boxes. They don't leave you a lot of margin for error, and this is the reason why here you can see me testing it without putting the drawer bottom. So whenever I'm using those drawer runners, what I will do is I would test the drawer box before I put the bottom. That way, if I've made any mistakes and I need to make some adjustments to the drawer box, I can still take it apart and make those adjustments and then put the bottom at the later stage. You can do it with the you can still take it apart with the with the button being on, but it's more difficult that way. And this is the reason I don't like those drawer runners, not because they're bad, but on this project we were doing a little bit more budget friendly, so that's why we were using them. And after that, it's just a case of sliding the bottoms. As you can see, I've had them pre-cut on the table. So one thing I like to do when I cut my drawer bottoms is I would leave them slightly wider than usual, so they have an overhang here towards the back. And you see me in a minute after I've pinned them. I would go over with a little block plane. You can do that with a router, with a flush bit, but I would trim it flush with the drawer, because you can spend all the time in the world trying to get the perfect measurement. So if it's just bright, or you can just leave a slight overhang like I do, and you can grab the little block plane and just plane it to size. Just easier for me that way. I just leave it a couple of millimeters wider than needed, or longer than needed, should I say? I don't know. Maybe the right word is longer in this instance. You get what I'm saying. But this is what I mean. I will just finish it off with a block plane. It's just a couple of passes. It's nothing heavy that needs to be done, but just a couple of passes to make sure it's flush. And then after that, I will just sand it, because once again, plywood is notorious for leaving splinters, so you've got to be careful with those. And then it's just a case of making the drawer faces. Now, these are simple flat drawer faces. We were thinking of having shaker style. That would have worked had we had the 3 equal sized drawers. However, at some point we've decided to have a 4th drawer in that unit, which is slightly shallower than the rest, and we tried that on the designs. It looked horrible with shaker style. It just really looked disproportional, so we opted for flat faces. As you can see here, those are just an MDF cut to size, and then after that I just put a chamfer with a router. You can do that with a block plane. I like to do that with block planes sometimes. However, when I'm making more than one piece, it's just easier to have the router set up, make sure that all of your pieces are absolutely identical. And that was about it in terms of making the cabinet. So the next thing we need to do is we need to make that leg that sits on the other side. So this is a geometrical leg, and the easiest way to find out the angles is to create a template. So as you can see here, I have done that. That would allow me to mock it up, measure with my angle gauge, transfer that measurement to the miter saw, and then cut all of my corners. And then once that was done, I can go ahead and assemble the leg. Now for this type of leg, fancy joinery is not really necessary, because the screws are there just to hold it in place, but the whole weight of the disc would be compressing the joint as opposed to pulling it apart. So realistically, none of the weight is going to be carried by those screws. So we can just pop it in place, and the whole weight of the disc will be on top of it. The other benefit of that is that we do not have to fill those screw heads, because none of those would be seen. You can imagine one set of them would be against the floor, and then the other one would be against the worktop. So we don't have to fill them. We could if we want to, because that leg is going to be painted, but we don't have to. And I didn't bother with that, because again, none of them would be seen. And once it's assembled, we're going over with a sander. I like to go with 80 grit first to remove most of the material, make sure it's nice and smooth. Then we follow up by going over with the 120 sandpaper to get it ready for painting. When we're done sanding, we can add a little chamfer with a router. So this is exactly the same chamfer I've added to the drawer faces and the face frame. I thought it's a nice touch. It's one of those little details that not many people would notice, other than me knowing it's there. But I kept the router set up like that for the entire process, just so I can make sure that all of the pieces have exactly the same size of chamfer. And then it was time to cover those bare plywood edges. So the product I'm using here, it's a real maple veneer strip. I do prefer to cover those edges once the drawer box has been assembled. You can do that once you have it in pieces, but it's a personal preference of mine to do that when I have them assembled. And then it was time to start preparing the worktop. So this is an ash worktop that I've gotten from woodworktops.com. This is my favorite place to get worktops. I use them a lot. By the way, this is not sponsored. They have given me absolutely nothing. But they're lovely people. I've ordered a lot of worktops from them, and they've always been good. They have a good selection, reasonable prices. So if you want to check them out, it's up to you. Once we have both pieces of the worktop cut to size, it is time to start working on that joint in order to create the L-shaped desk. So the way we do that is we have to cut those grooves in which we put our worktop clamps. Worktop clamps are just a simple bolt that bolts the two pieces of worktop together. It's an easier way to explain it that way. There's a couple of different ways you can make those grooves, but the easiest one is if you use a kitchen fitting jig, such as that one from Trend, and a router with a collet, because that way you can make sure that the grooves are corresponding on both pieces and it aligns properly. So now that all of this is done, we put a couple of biscuits just for good measure, and this is actually a really good use for the biscuit jointer because it's essentially just for alignment purposes. So those biscuits don't really do anything structural, but they make sure that both pieces of the worktop are aligned perfectly and we have a nice flush top. Here, as you can see me testing it, and I'm pretty happy with that joint. Then the final thing we need to do before we deliver this on site is to cut those round overs on the worktop on both sides. So I had a couple of ideas here. My idea was to cut this thing with a jigsaw just before the pencil mark, and then use that round over template, the MDF template that's behind me, with in a combination with a router and a flush trim bit. That did not work very well. Here I'm trying with a collet, still wasn't very happy. The router bit did not like that end grain. It kept bouncing. It was very unsafe. So what I ended up doing is this, which is a couple of hours with a rasp and a sander, and I kept checking it with my combi square just to make sure that I get it perfect. Maybe in the future I will invest a bit more money into flush router trim bits, specifically the helical ones. However, at the time I did not have one, so I had to improvise and just get it done in a different way. So as you can see, this is the office we're working with, kind of tiny, and this is the desk installed. So as we're getting towards the end of this video, I'd like to give credit to the people who have watched it to the end by telling you what the cost of this project was. So the total price for our customer, including delivery and installation, was about £1,200. I would appreciate if you leave me a comment letting me know whether you think this is expensive, cheap or reasonably priced. However, I would kindly ask you not to put the price in the comments. That way I would know anyone who's commented has watched the video to the end. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one.